In this episode, we are going to make our entry into the history of Indian nationalism, which had passed through many complex stages. We know that Indian nationalism had begun on a very limited scale in the urban world among the intelligentsia, but in the early part of the 20th century, it became a massive anti-colonial upsurge. But before we actually delve into the complexities of this history, it may be useful for us to start with some of the major arguments on which basis Indian nationalism had been studied by historians. Many of the nationalist histories that were written after independence, which boasted about the great heights that the nationalist movement had achieved, had drawn on their inspiration from this nationalist history writing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The latter kind of history that the nationalists had written were written at a time when there was an urgency on the part of the historians to come to terms with British rule as an entity, as an exploitative system, as a kind of an ideological denunciation of India's unity. So, whether it is the history of national unity that the nationalists were projecting during colonial times, or the kind of assessment that the historians were making about Indian nationalism after independence, you cannot see such histories completely in isolation from the politics of the time. As we shall see later, that the view that Indian nationalism contained within its body different kinds of regional movements was dictated to a large extent by the rise of regional movements, or the fact that the nationalists were not caring about the interest of the peasantry or the ordinary people, were also to a large extent shaped by the performance of the independent Indian state. The kind of expectation that people had about the Indian state after independence was not always fulfilled. And those whose aspirations were fulfilled naturally were very critical, not merely about the Indian state, but about the manner in which the history of nationalism itself anticipated some of the inadequacies of the Indian state after independence. So historiography, which is basically the history of history writing, considers the context in which the historians are writing. So if you go back to the later part of the 19th century or the early 20th century and try to outline the basic features of what was known as the nationalist historiography in the early part of the 20th century, you see at one level the indictment of British rule by people like Dadabhai Naoroji or Ramesh Chandra Datta, both of whom, as you know, were important congressmen. And Naoroji wrote about the manner in which imposition of British rule had been responsible for the widespread mass poverty in India, the manner in which the British destroyed local industries, imposed high revenue demand on the peasantry, the way Indian economy was drained of its resources since the plunder of Plassey had begun, became the source of this enormous poverty in India. And this was precisely the theme on which R. Siddharth also wrote the famous economic history of India, the first economic history written about on India, about the impact of British rule. And R. Siddharth's arguments fitted in with the overall nationalist economic critique of imperialism. The critique of imperialism which accused British rule of destruction of local industries, drain of wealth, imposition of so high a revenue demand on the peasantry that the peasants were unable to show much of agricultural enterprise. So the creation of mass poverty was the creation of British rule. So that was one line of argument. The other kind of argument that emerges from this early nationalist history writing in the early part of the 20th century, or the turn of the 19th century, concerns the vision of unity of India.
How did the early nationalist historiography imagine India's unity?
They imagined Indian unity in terms of unity in diversity. There are many religions, many linguistic groups, many regional ethnic groups, but despite the existence of such diversities, the nationalists thought about an essential unity. And this assimilationist dimension of Indian unity was emphasized in different kinds of cultural history that historians of India in pre-independent India had written. There were syncretic tendencies in Indian religion, how Islam and Hinduism, apart from the history of conflict certainly that these two religions had, ultimately created an assimilationist syncretic culture at the popular level. For example, they talked about the impact of Sufism in Indian culture, the attraction that the Sufis had for the Bhakti saints, or the inspiration that the Sufis provided to the Bhakti saints in the Middle Ages, the manner in which the people in the localities, both Hindus and Muslims, were offering their worship to the shrines, to the shrines of the Peer. Idea of Sattopir. There was an underlying stream of unity which was emerging from the assimilationist syncretic culture. To talk about India's unity during British rule, or to recount the history of India's movement against foreign rule, in which Congress certainly played a critical role, are two different things. Because the ideas that the nationalist historiography at the very early stage had propounded was a part of the struggle against British rule. But once independence was achieved, once historians began to delve deeper into the complex layers of mobilization against British rule, they began to assert that if nationalism in the late 19th century remained very limited to the intelligentsia who were exposed to English education, who absorbed modern political ideas and found that the modern ideals, the Western ideals, democratic ideals that the British were preaching in their own country were never applied to India. So the aspect of un-Britishness of British rule had as one of its features the critique of British rule causing mass poverty. The other dimension concerns the failure on the part of the British to give Indian self-rule. And democratic ideals actually came to India through English education, to which the intelligentsia became exposed and they absorbed these new ideas, and they created their own associations through which initially in the late 19th century the demand for self-government was raised. Historians recently have tried to analyze the emergence of the Congress in 1825 in terms of the rise of a nationalist public sphere. Print culture, for example. Newspapers began to proliferate. Vernacular newspapers published from localities were reporting events of national importance. Even though, say, for example, a small town newspaper in Bengal had nothing to do with textile mills, which were by then concentrated in Western India under indigenous enterprise, were regularly reporting about the iniquities of the British tariff policy, which deprived these infant textile mills in Western India of the prospect of further development. So certain issues were emerging in the public sphere, particularly because of the contribution of print culture, as important hallmarks of what we call a nationalist public sphere. The people who were inspired by these nationalist ideals were arriving at a consensus or to work out an alternative argument about how better India would be under the government of a free state. Associations were formed to articulate demands for self-government, or at least demands for some kind of representative government, which the British were systematically denying to Indians. And In the early part of the 20th century, such demands became much more powerful with the rise of Gandhian nationalism. The nationalist historiography draws a straight line from, say, 1885 when the Congress was founded as the first expression of an Unitarian nationalism on the basis of earlier experiments with provincial associations to a major turning point in the history of nationalism in the 1920s when, under the leadership of Gandhi and some of his closest followers, were emerging from the provinces with a record of popular movement as the generals of the Gandhi's army, who were transforming the character of nationalism and making it into a kind of mass nationalism. So the integration of the peasants, the integration of the so-called backward provinces, not just Bengal, Madras and Bombay, which were more advanced educationally and therefore dominated nationalist politics in the 19th century, but by the early 20th century, when mass nationalism began to emerge with the active involvement of the peasantry, with the active leadership of the intermediary levels of leaders recruited from the hitherto backward regions like United Provinces or Bihar, this was mass nationalism.
So how do you respond to the view that the Congress mobilization of the peasantry had many imperfections?
Certainly there were imperfections in the sense that many of the promises that the Congress leadership had given to the peasants were never fulfilled. And such indications were clear once Congress was in power in 1937 in some of the provinces. So you can see the imperfections, as the Marxists had done, in the kind of bourgeois landlord class bias of the Congress. Certainly the intelligentsia were recruited largely from the landowning classes. Not always very large landowners, but small landowners. You look at Bengal, for example, most of these English educated elites came from the petty landowning classes. You find similar things among the Chitwavan elite of Bombay, which dominated nationalist leadership. In Punjab, for example, the money lending communities were very influential. So such people, because of their class bias, would not actually allow the Congress to undertake any radical social movement or to undertake strategies of any radical social transformation that very often the local organization of the Congress had promised to the peasantry. So these imperfections certainly existed, but one has to recognize that Congress actually provided certain basic lessons of organizations to the peasantry. If you look at the late 19th century peasant movements, which were mostly sporadic, which came in cycles, but which were never able to create a kind of a massive upsurge that you come across in the 1920s or 30s, when peasants became integrated within the Congress movement, when local leaders of the Congress were able to mobilize their peasant followers in the rural areas, when the Congress organizations were actually proliferating at the local level, and historians have found out how, as a consequence of the spread of Congress organizations at the local level, the Congress itself created a kind of an alternative state, a chain of command, which actually links the Congress High Command at the top with the block level or the village level Congress organization. So who are these men? These men were not always very powerful men or rich men who would be deliberately plotting strategies against their compatriots. These men brought nationalism to the peasants. Very often it is suggested that if nationalism in the 19th century existed in the mind of the leaders, nationalism in the 20th century managed to enter the heart of the people. And the crucial role that these local mobilizers had played requires to be recognized when we talk about the imperfections of the Congress. Imperfections certainly existed in the nationalist mobilization of the Congress, even in the Gandhian phase, but while we recognize these imperfections, we are also required to have some sympathy for the nationalist Unitarian argument of the kind that you come across in the works of scholars like Majid Siddiqui, For example, he wrote on agrarian mobilization in United Provinces or present-day Uttar Pradesh, where he shows how the Congress actually taught the peasants to stand on their own feet. There were local organizers like Baba Ramchandra who had been able to mobilize the peasantry and brought them within the fold of the Congress. And it is not proper to minimize the importance of the kind of contribution that the Congress organizations were making to the what is known as peasant nationalism or to what is known as mass nationalism. During the 1950s and 1960s, in the immediate aftermath of independence, where people were euphoric about achievement of freedom, when the people were looking for prospects of a free, prosperous India, some of the problems inherent in nationalism were somewhat overlooked. It was a discourse of optimism. But this discourse of optimism, to some extent, was outweighed by a certain kind of discourse of disillusionment with the nation state when regional movements began to surface in independent India, when independent peasant movements were questioning the legitimacy of the Indian state. For example, in Bengal and certain other parts of India, large-scale movements by the peasantry under radical communist leadership questioned the legitimacy of the Indian state. So it is in such changing context of the 1960s and 1970s, embarrassing questions began to be raised by historians about the Unitarian standpoint that nationalist historiography had always suggested.
Sir, how far is it valid to write these examples of regionalism as forms of nationalism?
No, it is not nationalism per se, but you have to admit that even Rabindranath Tagore actually in one of his essays suggested that Indian nationalism must be understood as Bharatvarsha Mahajati. So there is the notion of a great Indian nation, but this great Indian nation in its body contained several little nationalisms. So if you are emphasizing the ability on the part of these little nationalisms to create a certain movements which were questioning the legitimacy of the Indian state after independence, then if you go backwards from this kind of a situation, there is every likelihood that you will find in these movements some kind of an alternative vision of nationalism which is more regionally focused or which is nourished by a sense of cultural unity at the regional level. So Tamil nationalism, for example, on which you have a very important work by a man called Eugene Ershik, an American historian. Ershik argues that the non-Brahmin movement, which emerged as a kind of a counterpoint to the Congress in Madras Presidency, was a consequence of the non-Brahmins identifying the Congress with the Brahmins. So the Congress was dominated by the Brahmins in South India, and the non-Brahmins who were disgruntled about Brahmin domination in the region found the Congress as a vehicle of Brahmin domination, and they created their own outfits, their own organizations, which we know as non-Brahmin mobilization, and these non-Brahmins looked upon the Brahmins and the Congress as a representative of an alien North Indian culture. Similarly, if you look at South India, for example, they soon came across Telugu nationalism, for example, in Andhra. So it is important to distinguish between this little nationalism and the great Indian nationalism, but historiographically speaking, one has to recognize that within this large country where you have multiple languages, different kinds of ethnic affiliations and loyalties, regional culture is capable of developing into some kind of alternative nationalism, some kind of nationalism which would at certain points of time question the legitimacy of the pan-Indian nationalism. But to overemphasize this little nationalism by way of demeaning the great achievement of Indian nationalism is of course not acceptable. You have another set of historians who became very powerful in the 1970s in terms of their influence on historical studies. These were historians from Cambridge University who constituted a kind of Cambridge School of Historiography, who argued that in order to understand the dynamic of Indian politics, it's useless to look at the nation or even at the region. You have to move down to the locality. You have to find out who the bosses were in the local context and how these bosses were actually organizing local factions and local parties in order to perpetuate, in order to preserve their local power. So if these local bosses had been drawn to all India parties, the intention was to retain and preserve their local power, for which reason they were forming factions in the local context. The Reddys of Andhra or the Raises of Allahabad in Chris Bailey's version, or the Reddy elite of Andhra in David Worshbrook's thesis on Madras politics.
Sir, isn't it a very considered view of Indian nationalism which doesn't consider at all the importance of nationalist ideology?
Of course it is a very conceited view. It actually draws attention to what is known as the government impulse in Indian politics, arguing that the ideological inspiration was not adequate enough for the people to come forward and participate in the national movement, because nationalism is empty rhetoric. What was important was achieving power within the imperial constitutional framework. You know that from 1880s onwards, when Ripon introduced the local self-government reform, you have a series of incremental reforms coming one after another, which gave Indians little bit of power at the provincial level. More powers, of course, after 1919, but so these historians are arguing that in order to achieve power at those higher levels, it was important for local historians to control local politics, or to retain their control over locality by forming local factions. Because without the control that they could exercise on local politics, it was difficult for them to ensure either their nomination or their election to the superior legislative bodies. So it is a conceited view. So in answer to this, the nationalist historiography, particularly scholars like Bipan Chandra, had argued that if such men or if congressmen had participated in these constitutional mechanisms, they were only short-term compromises. So they were compromising with imperialism only for short-term purposes, in order to put greater pressure on the British once opportunities would arise, so that this unremitting pressure on the British created a situation in the 1940s when the British felt that ruling India had become almost an impossible proposition. So the compromises that the nationalist leaders were making with imperialism by agreeing to participate in the constitutional system were only short-term compromises. It did not actually suggest that the main reason of conflict, which was located by the nationalist in India's poverty, which was located by nationalists in imperial racism, which actually denied Indians the right of self-rule, the main sources of conflict were never resolved until India achieved independence. And if Indians participated in the constitutional machineries or the constitutional system that the British had created, enticed by the prospects of power, these were short-term compromises that the Indians were making. Some historians have gone further than the mere statement that there were imperfections in the mobilization. Some historians who belong to the subaltern school have tried to argue that the world of peasant politics in the villages and the world of elite politics, of which Congress was, of course, the best expression, the finest expression, the most powerful expression, there was a deep chasm, the two different worlds. As in the 19th century, the peasants participated in the peasant movements of various kinds in different parts of India, perhaps sporadically or spasmodically. Such trends continued even after the Congress mobilization of the peasantry had begun from 1920s onwards. The peasants had their own visions, peasants had their own conception of independence, which did not always tally with the kind of calculation that the Congress leaders had about how to remove the British. The Congress strategy was based certainly on calculations of the strength of the empire. So they moved towards the goal in stages. The peasants' vision of independence was different. If the congressmen thought of the removal of British rule and achievement of power by a national government as the first objective to be fulfilled by the national movement, the peasants thought that the creation of a just and equitable world minus the oppression of the local oppressors was the ultimate achievement of freedom.
Sir, then what were the major contributions of the subaltern studies to the understanding of Indian nationalism?
This is one important dimension where you can see how the politics of the peasantry is looked upon as an independent sphere, where the peasants were able to think out their ideas about independence somewhat differently from the manner in which the urban leaders or the intelligentsia were actually defining the goals of independence. The peasants looked upon Gandhi Maharaj as the bringer of justice. And Gandhi's notion of Ram Rajya appealed to them because this notion of Ram Rajya implied a land without oppression, without the oppression of the local landowners or the local moneylenders. In a series of very influential essays published in the number of volumes of subaltern studies, the scholars like Gyanendra Pandey or Sumit Sarkar and others had drawn attention to the manner in which peasant mobilization had continued to take place at times independently of Congress initiative. Peasant nationalism had defined the goals of freedom somewhat differently from the manner in which the Congress leaders were defining it. And these are all suggestive of an unbridgeable divide between the world of peasant politics and the urban politics of the nationalist leaders. But more importantly, the new historiographical perspective the subaltern studies has brought about in our assessment of nationalism, about the extent to which the women became involved in the national movement, the extent to which women were able to achieve leadership positions in the national movement, the extent to which nationalism was able to provide emancipatory promises or emancipatory ideals for women. The subaltern studies has also drawn attention to the manner in which the Dalits occasionally felt estranged from the mainstream nationalism, how women still had to operate under rules of patriarchy, how Dalits had to operate under rules of casteism, for which reason B.R. Ambedkar thought that achieving citizenship in independence was the first priority for the Dalits, because without this they would not be able to achieve freedom. So while we conclude, we appreciate the very important contribution that the subaltern's perspective has made to our understanding of the complexities of Indian nationalism, but at the same time you have a new kind of a history of nationalism in which attention has become focused on the cultural history of nationalism, the history of Indian archaeology, for example, history of Indian museums, for example, in which historians are trying to assemble materials which try to suggest a story that the Indian intellectuals had become anxious to present a very glorious image of India in order to contain the imperialist labeling of India as an inferior people. So you have a nationalist cultural history emerging, or at least a history of Indian culture which tries to address this problem of how nationalist culture, in the sense of understanding of India's past or understanding of Indian archaeology, became a source of inspiration for nationalism during British rule.